Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham, and we're just 3 weeks into Donald Trump's second presidency, and already there's a lot happening. At the time of this recording, President Trump has issued at least 53 orders. They range from attempts to end birthright citizenship to renaming the Gulf of Mexico and Mount Denali. They also include a lot of tariffs against Canada and Mexico that have now been paused, and tariffs against China that have been met with counter tariffs from that country.
Tia, it's hard to keep it all straight.
So hard.
And Trump ran on promises to shrink the federal workforce, impose tariffs, harden America's borders, and eliminate diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts in the federal government. Promises he appears to be making good on now. While President Trump's pace of action may seem dizzying or chaotic to Americans who didn't vote for him, half of the country did vote for him. Producer Sam Corey sat down with Michael Seltzer. The two began by discussing what Michael makes of Trump in his first weeks of office. Seltzer is someone who has voted for Trump 2 times.
It's been exactly as advertised. He was going to hit the ground running. He had 4 years of thinking about the possibility of getting back into this position. He made promises along the way. He was much more ready. Obviously, after having served a previous 4-year administration and coming into it in 2016 with really no foundation. I mean, the man was not really expecting to win and wasn't prepared, and he made some bad choices. This time he came roaring in. Sure, some of it is going to be off-putting because he is reactionary. He is explosive. He is unpredictable. Those were many of the reasons that people aligned with this president.
Without a doubt, he's doing a lot. I mean, he's had at least 53 executive orders. I am curious where you stand on these things. What things do you think are really good, and maybe some things that you're like, I don't know how that one's going to play out?
Look, he is a complicated but very transparent individual who shoots from the hip and says things that come to his mind. Unlike most politicians, he's completely unfiltered. So when a thought comes to his mind, and it occurs to me going back to the COVID days when he said something about shooting alcohol into your veins or whatever, things are taken out of context and drummed up as controversial when it's just chit-chat. Now, I get it. He's supposed to be filtered. We're used to politicians being filtered. So are there things within his canon right now that I don't necessarily agree with? Of course there are. There's no politician ever that you can have 100% solidarity with. But we've had enough experience with politicians who make all kinds of promises and claims, and then as soon as they're elected, those claims and promises are out the window. I don't see that with Trump.
Do you, Michael? You bring up a really interesting question though, which is like, as a Trump supporter, I'm curious how you know when he's serious about something and when he's not. Because as you were saying, like there's a lot of unfiltered things happening through Trump, and we know that's part of him, right? That's part of who he is. There's not. It's like what you see is what you get. But then it becomes hard to know, I think, when he's really serious about something and when he's not. How do you know when he's serious about something and when he's not?
Look, he has a very unique style, and if you've ever been to a Trump rally, then you would get it. Because a Trump rally is like a love fest. It's like the biggest rock concert you've ever been to, with an auditorium or an arena filled with beloved fans who are truly there passionately. You make more friends at a Trump rally than you can make at any rock concert. And he says things off the cuff. He's reading from a teleprompter, but his teleprompter portion of his presentation is probably a third of what he actually says and does while he's out on that stage.
I'm curious about your friends who are also Trump supporters. Are they really excited about what he's doing? Is this a time of triumph? Is this a time of celebration? Or are there also things that they're kind of squeamish about?
I would say the general consensus for many of my conservative friends right now is, first, every day is Christmas because every headline in the newspaper is something that Trump promised he was going to do right out of the gate, and he's doing it. And there is a sort of cathartic relief that after taking so much abuse, we who are conservative, who felt differently about the previous administration and Trump, feel vindicated because we were so right and they were so wrong. Having said that, I have many conservative friends who are happy that we won the election, but reserved about expectations. I have some that are, challenging some of his executive orders and decisions. I get it, and we should challenge them. They're not all perfect. I will agree that the January 6th relief that was promised perhaps went a little bit overboard, and that there were some people in there that were released that should not have been released. But I think what happened was after Joe Biden decided to pardon not only his son, which we all expected, and he lied about throughout, but we expected that one. But when he decided to pardon his entire family preemptively, and he decided to pardon the January 6th investigative group, I think that Trump probably looked at that and said, you know what, the hell with it. We're going to let them all go. Because if we were going to go through the files and try to ferret out the good from the bad, this could take months.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm speaking with Michael Seltzer. He's a Franklin Village trustee councilman, and he voted for Donald Trump this past presidential election. We're talking about Michael's reactions to Trump's actions thus far. Michael, you're talking a little bit about all the things that he's done, which is a lot, as noted, lots and lots of executive orders. Executive orders, importantly, can be overturned when another president comes into office. They're not pieces of legislation. They're not constitutional amendments. What do you think Trump is getting most of his political actions done through executive orders instead of through congressional action, with the exception of the Laken Riley Act?
Well, again, I think he decided that he wanted to jumpstart his presidency. He'd been planning and prepping for this. And so, I can tell you that we were there in the last ball on the night before his official swearing in. And he was dancing at 1 o'clock in the morning at that Starlight Ball, and we were there. And 2 hours later, he was in the Oval Office signing a flurry of executive orders that had been prepared and holding a news conference. So I understand that there are ways around executive orders, but they will be in place for as long as he's president, or until such time as a federal judge or some judge decides to overturn them, and then they'll go through the process. So not all of them are going to stick, and I get that. I understand it. I would like to see a more welcoming Congress. I would like to see an ability for government to function with a bipartisan spirit, but I'm afraid that ship has sailed.
Well, you did see some bipartisan. I mean, the Laken Riley Act was a bipartisan piece of legislation.
True, and I will stand by the fact that is a rarity, unfortunately. It's a tough place. Politics is a really ugly place right now.
Yeah.
And it didn't start with Trump. Mm-hmm. And I think that's another point that needs to be looked at, because everybody says all of this negativity came from Trump, and it didn't.
Michael, I agree. I agree with this. I think most people would agree with that it came before Trump. I think they would also say that he amplifies the negativity. Would you disagree with that?
Well, again, he is very unique. He's blustery. He shoots from the hip. He's unfiltered. So, yeah, I don't think he's done anything to ingratiate himself with the people that don't like him. But, again, from a conservative perspective, we as a group have been denigrated for the past 4+ years, and even during the years that he was president. How can you decide to support somebody like that, an intelligent person like you?
Trump won political office As you noted, he won over people from all sorts of demographics, and particularly he won over a lot of poor and working class voters. There are now a lot of billionaires and very wealthy people around him holding higher positions or just really close to his ear. Does that concern you for what might come for working people? In other words, do you think there's a chance that inequality will expand over the next 4 years? What do you make of this dynamic?
Look, I'm very, very focused on merit-based hiring, and I'm very focused on having smart people surrounding you. I ran a business for 40 years. I wasn't the smartest guy, but I knew enough, and I knew to surround myself with great, talented, mostly women, who helped me build a successful marketing and publishing business, and I give great credit to all of them. I don't think it hurts to have smart, successful, brilliant business people being a part of politics, because we haven't had a lot of that. We've got a lot of attorneys and a few doctors. I mean, most everybody in Congress are either attorneys or doctors. How many of them are business people?
I want to end by talking a little bit about culture. I'm wondering if you're, and other Trump supporters you talk to are excited about the cultural changes that are happening. I do think that's a big part of the Trump administration. He comes off as strong in an old school masculine way. He is, or at least wants to be, colorblind and anti-DEI. He also has a manifest destiny appeal, right? He wants to control Greenland and the Panama Canal. Is that a big part of why Trump supporters are celebrating right now? Is the cultural aspect important?
You know what? I think that the pendulum swings, and it swung too far left, and that culturally there are many, many people in this country who are strongly opposed to sex education being taught to young people at too early of an age, encouraging young people to explore sexuality in schools when it should be something that parents should deal with on their own. I am a proud father of a gay daughter, so I absolutely support gay rights, and I support gay marriage, and I don't think it's endangered here. You cannot paint Republicans with a broad brush, and that's what people unfortunately do. But I do think there's been a culture war, and that the left went too far to the left on men and women and what's in between that, and men and women's sports. I think a lot of people feel strongly about those things, just like a lot of people feel strongly about abortion and, are pro-life. It's hard to crystallize so many different beliefs and the pull that each party has had in one direction or another. There needs to be a centrist perspective. And I don't know when or how we're going to get there, but I think eventually, if you pull too far to the left, then the right is going to start to come back into focus, as is happening now. If you pull too far to the right, we're going to end up in the same place. So somehow, over the next 4 years, I hope we can find a comfortable medium that everyone can sort of feel comfortable about.
That was producer Sam Corey speaking with Michael Seltzer, a Franklin Village trustee who's voted for Trump many times, about what he makes of Trump's first few weeks in office. As we've noted, President Trump has signed a lot of executive orders, but not all of those orders will be implemented. Many of his executive orders are or will be challenged in court. Just yesterday, Trump's order to end birthright citizenship was blocked by a federal judge for the second time. The result of all of this is a lot of confusion about what will or won't stick. But as many scholars and journalists have observed, the chaos and confusion might be part of the strategy.
And all of those headlines are reaching Americans through a fragmented media landscape. Today, most adults get some form of news from social media, spaces like TikTok and YouTube, X and Instagram. These apps are showing Americans what the algorithm thinks will grab and hold their attention. Meanwhile, radio, newspapers, television stations are also vying for your attention, but in different ways. The scariest stuff often sticks to the top of our news feeds. The result is often doom scrolling and information overload. So, what are we supposed to do with all the news, politics, an uncertainty that steals our attention with push notifications and sensational headlines. How can we remain balanced in an age when our attention can constantly be hacked, when our politics are marked by chaos? We'll be exploring these topics this hour, and we want to hear from you. How has your media diet changed over time? The number is 313-577-1019.
Coming up, we'll get to your calls and explore how to stay balanced during a time that many understand as one of political and informational chaos. Stay with us. It's The Metro.
On 1019 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Every day on our televisions and our phones, we're inundated with headlines, videos, notifications, and ads. They push into our lives whether we like it or not. Enter American politics. In the last few weeks, the frenzied pace of news has sped up even more. Since President Donald Trump's inauguration a few weeks ago, he's already signed 53 executive orders and counting, and he's taking swift action to fundamentally change government in the U.S. He's put Elon Musk, owner of SpaceX, Tesla, and X, and the richest man in the world, in charge of shrinking the federal workforce. He has tried, and so far failed, to end birthright citizenship in the U.S. He's threatened, then paused, tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and enacted tariffs on China.
Now, Robin, not everything President Trump tries to accomplish through executive order will stick. But the speed at which he's taking action makes it very hard to look into the future and know what to expect. Right now, we want to talk about that uncertainty. What can we do in our lives to take control of our precious time and attention? How do we do this while also engaging with news and media in a way that works for us, that is balanced with our relationships, our responsibilities, and our passions? We're going to tackle these questions this hour, and we're starting with Emily Sidner. She's a senior researcher at the Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship and teaches communications at Syracuse University. Professor Sidner, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So, Professor, a lot of people feel anxious right now. Why do you think that is? Where is that coming from? Is it simply just information overload?
Yeah, I think information overload is definitely a part of it, right? We live, as you all have already suggested, in an era where we're sort of constantly being bombarded with information, and it's designed to make us think it's the most important thing we need to pay attention to, right? We know that when our phones ding, we have this sort of Pavlovian response where we want to pick it up and look at it. And if we've got news alerts turned on, then it's one after another that leads us thinking, oh my gosh, this is the next important thing to pay attention to. But it's also the kind of news we're consuming and the sort of chaotic way in which it's being shared with us. And so it's a little bit, I think, about content and about frequency.
Mm-hmm. And how does anxiety show up in people's lives? Like, what are some of the things that make, what are some of the ways that anxiety, manifests itself? How do you see that in a person? What are some of the signs that we're looking for?
So I think one way to think about anxiety is that, first off, there's sort of two different types, right? There's a sort of generalized anxiety, people that naturally are sort of more predisposed to be nervous, looking for things that might be threatening to them. And then there's more of the sort of one-off anxiety that comes from specific events, right? So think about if you ever studied for a test and you waited till the last minute, that's a type of anxiety that sort of sparks right before that test when you're cramming and then goes away afterwards. And one of the things we know about that kind of anxiety is that some of it can be really motivating. It can lead us to look for more information, to actually study for the test, for example. but too much of it can be paralyzing, right? It sort of freezes us. It makes us want to step back, disengage, not study for the test at all, for example. And when we're looking for those different things, right, one of them can be a sort of tendency to keep fixating on the thing that is making us anxious in the first place. So in the context of news, you might look for sort of constant attention to the same pieces of information over and over again, if that makes sense.
Of course it does. And our algorithms make sure that it continues to feed some of those things that we stay on. But, just talking about those two different types of anxiety that you're talking about, and I think about those who do have general anxiety, whether it's a low level or higher level in that threshold. How do they distinguish between having a general anxiety moment and versus a one-off? And what do we talk about, or how do we explain those compounded situations when they do occur? Because a lot of us are just generally living with anxiety right now. But how do we go through the compound of the two that we're dealing with? Is regular general anxiety added together with what's happening right now in the world and the media?
Yeah, so I think that I'm going to leave the sort of what do we do about our generalized anxiety to the therapists and psychiatrists out there rather than the political communication scholars. But I can tell you that, some of this can be sort of our own recognition of what is triggering both of those things to line up, right? So for anyone that is, say, feeling anxious about the news today, one of the things that they might then pay more attention to is how much am I consuming news? What kinds of news am I consuming? Where is it coming from? And trying to put strategies in place to make sure that they are continuing to be informed about whatever it is that they have determined is important for them to know, while also stepping away potentially from things that are leading them to just spend, say, hours reading one story after another about a particular thing that maybe is not the most productive use of their time.
Yes, Professor, yes. So moving towards what we were talking about in that intro there, Trump's administration's strategy of chaos change and the way we show up emotionally. Can you talk a little bit about how much of this chaos theory or strategy here is really showing up emotionally on some of the folks that you've been able to interact with?
Yeah, so I think one way I can certainly point to is I'm based in Washington, D.C., and so I am friends with a lot of federal workers, and certainly the chaos of sort of what's happening from one day to the next when it comes to federal funding, when it comes to the workforce, have certainly really led to emotional roller coasters for a lot of those people, right, who are trying to figure out, will I have a job in the next few months? Will I be able to pay my mortgage, et cetera? But for the people that are a step sort of removed from that, right?
Professor Sendor?
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
We got you. There you
Excellent.
are.
It muted for totally unknown reasons. Anyway.
Technology.
My apologies. But so what I was saying is if we're thinking about the people sort of one step removed from the policies that are being put in place, the hard part is figuring out what it is, when to pay attention and when to step back, right? And so thinking about, what are the pieces within the chaos that I care the most about, right? Maybe it's federal funding, and so I'm going to pay a lot of attention to the news around what's happening with the National Science Foundation or data at the CDC, but I'm going to pay less attention to, what's going on with the Office of Personnel Management. Maybe it's something, even farther removed from national politics than that, right? How are Trump's decisions influencing, people in Michigan or in my local community, and really being thoughtful about what is the information I need to know to do my job, to hold my elected officials accountable, et cetera.
Yeah, and what information can I let go of? Just completely just let go of. Such a difficult thing to sort through. You're listening to The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're speaking with Emily Sidner. She's a senior researcher at the Institute for Democracy journalism and citizenship. We're talking about how overwhelmed many people are feeling right now in this politically uncertain moment. And we also want to hear from you. Have you started tuning out the news because of information overload? Give us a call, 313-577-1019. Professor Sidner, as we talk about folks who are feeling really overwhelmed, it has me wondering about the ones who are not necessarily overwhelmed in this political moment. What kinds of things are they doing to not feel so anxious?
Yeah. So, I mean, some people might not feel particularly anxious because this is the right kind of news that they either enjoy consuming or it aligns with their political preferences, in which case they're having a different emotional reaction to what's going on these days. We might also see people who don't necessarily read the news and feel anxious about what's happening, but maybe feel angry, in which case, right, anger is a more motivating emotion. And so maybe that leads them to engage in different political activities or different types of engagement. So maybe they're using that emotion to protest or call their congresspeople or channeling it into community activism or things like that. Other people, right, may have just developed strategies to minimize that anxiety, right? So maybe it is that they are consuming less. Maybe they're consuming different types of information. So not cable news, but maybe reading a physical newspaper, or Substacks that are more about analysis than sort of immediate breaking news.
Sure.
Things like that.
Sure, because we know a lot of television news is a lot of commentary, and it's not necessarily, they don't delineate between the facts and that commentary, and it is about keeping you watching for as long as possible. Let's talk about how to get out of the news for a moment. You argue that we should be trying to see people more now. What does that look like? What do you mean by that?
Sure. So I will start with an example. I have a set of friends that are all on the same text thread, and we use it to share a lot of news and sort of political commentary amongst one another. And I will sometimes read that and think, oh my gosh, these friends are really struggling with what the information they're consuming. I can see it making them anxious. And then when I talk to them in person, that anxiety is still there, but it's moderated substantially, right? And I sort of have to remind myself that the way that we're talking to each other online, even in a text thread, is different than the way that we engage with people when we can look them in the eye and have a face-to-face sort of long-form conversation. And so one of the ways that I recommend that people sort of deal with some of their anxiety around the news and the chaos that's in the news these days is to not only just take a step back from the news, but seek out opportunities to connect with people in person, face to face, and sort of focus on their local community, whatever that looks like.
And what does that do, interacting with people, to our political psychology? How does that change the way that we think about and interact with politics when we're all of a sudden in these face-to-face situations that, as you have noted, are often going to be much more civil than if you are behind a computer screen?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is it just reminds us of the humanity of sort of these decisions, and that, if we're interacting with a diverse set of people, which is plausible in all sorts of ways, and we might have friends that voted for the opposing party or who are, interested in different elements of politics than us, it helps us sort of remember all of the nuance of these issues and the debates around them in a way that, because of the sort of incentive structures and platform limitations of a lot of media, right, they can't get into in the same way, right? That the conversation that I have with a friend about, again, sort of as an example, the federal workforce changes is going to look different than the way it's presented in the media.
Right, to get that that more nuanced, personal kind of perspective. One of the side effects, though, of talking with people we disagree with can also be anger. But you argue that anger can be good. How can anger be more of a positive emotion?
Yeah, I think, so one factors that we sort of know about anger is that it usually has a target, right? That unlike anxiety, which can be sort of just, everything makes me nervous or makes me feel more threatened, anger tends to have someone that we allocate blame to, regardless of whether or not potentially there's that is accurate. It can help to have a sort of focused outlet for that emotion. And if we can sort of try to channel that to more productive outcomes, right? So not using our anger to get online and yell at other people, but instead to say, okay, this policy change around, say, immigration makes me really angry. What can I do in my local community to help immigrants, to help make sure that people feel safe, that they have access to goods and services that they need, right? So you can use, you think about when you're angry, people want to throw things, or there's a physical sort of outburst that comes with anger. And you can use that sense of sort of output to go do things that you might not otherwise be inspired to do.
Professor Sidner, in the last 30 seconds we have here, I'm wondering how you, as someone who studies communication, who studies the media, how have you changed your own behavior amid this changing media landscape and our current political news happening so fast?
Yeah, I've definitely been really thoughtful about what it is I need to know, right? So if I think about myself as a teacher and a researcher first, what is the information I need to know and what can I let go, as we've been talking about? I've also used some of the sort of tricks on my phone to limit my news. So I have it set to not show me alerts when I'm at work or after 9 p.m. And so I can still find that information, but it will tell me, are you sure you want to look? It's been X amount of time. So that I have to take a pause and say, am I looking at this information because it is important to what I need to know? Or am I doing it because I'm just sort of mindlessly scrolling through from one story to the next that's feeding this anxiety? And usually at this point, I can tell the difference between the two, and having the reminder from my phone gives me a moment to say, okay, it's time to step back, or no, I'm going to keep reading for a little bit longer.
Emily Sidner is a senior researcher at the Institute for Democracy, Journalism, and Citizenship and an associate professor of communications at Syracuse University. Professor Sidner, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
Coming up, our information landscape and the current political age are both marked by chaos, and that means that people have had to shift the way they engage with a variety of media outlets. And so we want to know, do you feel overwhelmed by the news nowadays? Have you started tuning out because of information overload? Give us a call. Let us know. 313-577-1019.
Next, we're going to try to understand how to interact with media in a way that doesn't make us go crazy. Stay with us on the Metro. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Metro on WDET. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. There's a very simple way to become more balanced in a political age marked by chaos that includes a constant flow of information. Simply tune it out. But if you're listening to this program, you probably think it's important to stay informed about what's happening in the world.
That's right, Tia. We do try to do our best job to keep you informed and inspired. We want to ask you, though, what does it look like to have a balanced media diet? A balance that is marked both by reading and listening to many different news sources, and one where you the listener, retains more emotional balance while doing so. The number is 313-577-1019. And to dig into that question, we have Jihi Jolly here. She's a freelance journalist and writer and someone who thinks a lot about media literacy and maintaining balance in a world marked by chaos. Jihi, welcome to the Metro.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So you've been writing about the media and our information age for at least a decade now. How have these things changed over that time period?
A great question. So just by way of introduction, I started thinking about this question of, why does it feel so icky and challenging to be a news consumer today when I was actually in journalism school, which was now, I think, like 10, 12 years ago. And it just started to feel at the time like the way that the news cycle was designed, which, obviously is for business purposes above all, absolutely didn't match how I, as a human being, felt good consuming information. I didn't need information 24 hours a day. I certainly, didn't need to be consuming news on social media. When we first got on social media, it was a place to engage with your community and friends, and then it became saturated with news, certainly over at least the last 10 years. So, we've seen a lot change in terms of how we consume and the platforms we're consuming on, where, in the early 2010s, a lot of our consumption was still reading websites on our desktops. You have a million browsers open at work, and you're kind of in the background reading, these news blogs that were emerging, in addition to, of course, your mainstream sources. And if you have a TV in your home, then obviously your evening news or whatever programs you watch. But I think over the last 10 years, what's changed quite dramatically is news is showing up every single place that you are, every single social media app. It's interrupting your day constantly. If you're not mindful about the way you're setting up notifications on your devices, it's constantly interrupting whatever you might be doing. And I think, at least personally, I think post-pandemic, it also started taking over my text messages. It just feels like people are constantly sending, what do you think of this? Did you see this? I don't know how to think about this. Oh my gosh, I'm so angry about this. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of changed from this experience of, I'm going to sit down to, watch this program or read this article at this given time, to I'm being interrupted constantly by things that are extremely emotionally loaded that I may or may not feel I can even do anything about.
Jihi, I think that a lot of people can relate when you say the words icky and challenging to describe what it's like to constantly pay attention to the news. And you mentioned that one thing you have done is that you no longer are looking to social media to get your news, maybe to jump onto that link to The Atlantic that seems interesting, or whatever you might be seeing in your feeds. Tell us then what you are doing, how exactly you've become more intentional in where you're getting your news from and what that looks like.
Sure, yeah. So I think the most common piece of advice that you'll hear when it comes to how do I feel less overwhelmed by the news is just to put limits on your consumption. But I found that is sort of just a Band-Aid solution, personally. So, of course, if your screen time use is too much, using tools, I think like our previous guest discussed, to just put limits is a great place to start. However, I think the deeper question that we often lose sight of, because we are not taught to ask ourselves this question, is why am I consuming news in the first place? What role is this information supposed to play in my life? Which, takes quite a bit of introspection to even remember to ask yourself that question. But I started asking myself that question just to figure out, if I know why I want to do something, then I can probably figure out a way to do it well, because that's how I solve every other problem in my life. I start with what are we trying to accomplish here? And so I do this in workshops with folks, and I've done this exercise with myself many times. I have just sort of this list of questions that I ask myself, which is first, what does news mean to me? And why am I consuming it at this point in my life? And, I, for example, have a young child who I need to keep safe and healthy. I have aging parents who live in a different state, so I like to know what's going on there. I have decisions to make about, our household, finances, just so many things related to family life. And then also my professional life, where I have to keep tabs on certain things in certain industries. And because I can kind of baseline know that and define that for myself, I can use that as a starting point to build a diet as much in the same way you would, with food, which is an excellent metaphor. If you are currently training for a marathon, you are going to approach how you eat very differently than when you are not training for a marathon, for example. And so after I sort of ask myself the why questions, I ask myself the how questions, which are, how much time do I actually have to consume information that I know is either going to be hard to understand or, given our current political climate, going to be very emotionally loaded? And again, in the morning, I have a baby to feed and take care of, so I don't have the leisure to sit there and scroll, through all my news apps in the morning, and I don't want to do that in front of my kid. So that's a kind of low bandwidth time of day for me. But if it's the first, 30 minutes before I jump into work, after I already have childcare, I can do a scan thoughtfully of the, publications that I trust or that I'm currently consuming. Similarly, if I'm waiting in line, it can be, in the past, it was very tempting for me to just do a quick scroll through either my news apps or social media or just watch the TV that's on in the background. And, we don't necessarily need to do that when we're waiting in line. So I started kind of,
If I could jump in, forgive me. I'm wondering something, though, when you talk about this intentionality, asking yourself, what do I personally want to gain from the news? Do you then run the risk of limiting ideas and perspectives that might be good in challenging your own viewpoints or biases?
That is a really excellent question. And this is where, it gets a little bit harder, but I think our values need to guide that decision. So that's sort of the third piece of, this kind of my needs and my time and my well-being. And so in my case, I grew up practicing Buddhism. And in Buddhism, our greatest or highest value is how do we create a more peaceful world in which we are really respectful of all people. That's kind of my guiding light. And that I now define as a need. So that requires me to intentionally choose to read things that I can sit with that I don't agree with. But if I didn't have a value guiding the decision to do that, I would never do that. So that's another exercise that I like to do with people if we do a workshop, what value system are you trying to live by? And if you are someone that values trying to understand people who think very differently from you, then there's ways to do that, but it's a difficult process. So you can sit down and kind of dig into an article that you're like, I know I don't agree with this, but I just need to sit with it, or I need to call someone and talk through, what I don't understand very intentionally. Does that make sense?
It does. It does indeed. You're listening to The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're speaking with Jeehee Jolly, a freelance journalist and writer. We're talking about how to achieve a balanced media diet and emotional state during a time when they are feeling a little overwhelmed. And we want to hear from you. If you do have a little time to give us a call, 313-577-1019. We would love to know, are you starting to feel a little overloaded by all the information that you're receiving? Jeehee, coming back to you, you write about media literacy. What does it look like to be media literate?
I think in today's day and age, the best way to understand media literacy is how can I start to practice the skills of journalism as a regular person. And that is simply, when I come across information, sort of the core values of journalism originally, where we're trying to vet information to get sound information out to people to help them take civic action, right, in a oversimplified way. So me as an individual, if that's the kind of life that I want to live, I too need to develop the ability to check the sources that I'm consuming. Hey, I saw this thing on social media. Who wrote it? Or this narrative, I keep seeing over and over again. Where did it originate? those kinds of things. I think being mindful of that. And then, of course, just verifying the things you're coming across are actually true. They're not AI generated. They're not propaganda. They're not just, intentionally, misleading, which is difficult. But actually, I think this is a skill that many people, and especially young people, should be taught to develop. If we, have the desire to just not be blindly consuming whatever is coming across our feed to outrage us, which a lot of the time may not be real. And secondly, I think just to round out the sources. So if you're over-consuming one kind of narrative or one kind of source, a journalist knows that they have to sort of understand the breadth of an issue, and that involves interviewing experts as well as, individuals affected by an issue. So why not do the same thing in our own life to just kind of understand that, which is very different than media literacy that was simply like you need to understand how newsrooms work and, what their intentions are, because we're way past the age where the news we consume is only coming from journalists.
I love that so much, Professor, because oftentimes we talk about just so many talking heads and so much commentary now. You just don't know what to believe and what to pull from. So you're telling folks, think like a journalist.
Yep.
Yes. So as journalists, we're tasked with a lot. And as you described, covering what's going on with depth and nuance, it's important. How do the emotional states of journalists change the coverage and the types of stories that an audience interacts with?
Oh, my gosh, we could have a whole big conversation about this. But all I'll say is journalists, I think it's the hardest. So I don't currently work in daily news or breaking news. I have the deepest respect for colleagues and friends that do, because human beings are not meant to consume information at that scale and speed, nor disseminate it. It's the people who are like the most burnt out tend to be the journalists covering a lot of this stuff. But I think that the most important thing to remember is just that they're human beings. And so having this kind of like blind view of, the media does this or the media does that, doesn't really help anybody. And to really just know that like the guidelines of the organization that's publishing something are sort of the best metric to know whether or not to trust it, because organizations have ethical codes, and they most of the time today they're publishing, this is our stance, this is where we're coming from, these are our biases, especially local and community organizations. So I think just being aware that there are human beings who are publishing this work, and they are most of the time doing their best, and, just being transparent about what their limitations are would help us just choose sources and not put too much pressure on a single source to be acting the way we think they should be acting, but rather let the entire plate round out what we're craving, if that makes sense.
Yes. And Professor Jeehee, before we get down to the end of this whole conversation, in terms of everything that we've talked about today in the media landscape and this being away from it and getting our eyes off of some of the news and all the constant things that are happening, if you could, just one more time for the audience, let us know some ways that we could set limits and boundaries and what that looks like.
Yeah. So I would say the kind of quick checklist is know your why. In this season of your life, why do you need the information you're looking for? Know what your capacity is. When in your day do you have the time, and how would you like to consume it? And then know your values. Well, are you looking to deepen your understanding of people that are hard to understand, or are you just trying to go deep on an issue that you really want to take some kind of civic action on, or are you just trying to choose a school for your kid and that's the project of the month? And accordingly, think like a journalist. Okay, so this is the thing I'm trying to do. What are the resources available to me that are reputable? Some from mainstream media, some just from individuals online that I can vet, look at, and help myself make that decision. Because I think when we feel empowered by information to take action, we won't feel angry or overwhelmed. But if we're just consuming and taking no action afterwards, it's just a recipe for overwhelm.
Jeehee Joly is a freelance journalist and writer, and someone who writes and thinks about media literacy and maintaining balance in a world marked by chaos. Jeehee, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Thank you.
That's it for the Metro today. If you want to listen back to shows from this week, you can find us on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts, and always at WDET.org. The show is produced by Sam Corey, Carrie Jr. II, and Jack Philbrandt. Our engineer is Nate Bender. Our senior producer is David Lyons.
The Metro is a production of WDET and a listener-supported service of Wayne State University. This is WDET-FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.